Harlem had a way of remembering things long after the rest of New York pretended to forget. It remembered the sound of horns drifting from open club doors at midnight, remembered the scent of roasted chestnuts in winter air, remembered the sermons that shook the rafters and the laughter that carried down Lenox Avenue like music. But more than anything, Harlem remembered names. And in the winter of 1935, one name carried both reverence and rumor in equal measure. Bumpy Johnson. He was not the tallest man in any room. He did not need to be. What he possessed instead was something far more commanding, a composure that never fractured, an intelligence sharpened by poetry and prison libraries, and a gaze that made even the loudest voices reconsider their tone. People who did not know him spoke of him in headlines and whispers. People who did know him spoke of him in measured respect. He moved through Harlem not like a conqueror, but like a custodian, someone who understood that power, when worn carelessly, could destroy the very ground it stood upon. The events that would change everything began not with gunfire or scandal, but with a letter. It arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the door of a modest brownstone near 138th Street. The envelope bore no return address, only 3 words scrawled in uneven ink: for Mr. Johnson. Inside was a single page, folded twice. The handwriting trembled as though each word had cost the writer courage. They are taking boys again. Not jail, not court, disappearing. There were no signatures, no explanations, only an address and a date. 7 days from now. When the letter was placed into Bumpy's hands, he read it once, then again, and finally folded it with the same care he gave to the pages of the poetry books he kept on his shelf. He did not react with outrage. He did not slam a fist against the table. Instead, he looked out the window toward the street where children were chasing each other on a lamppost, unaware of the currents moving beneath their laughter. They think we don't notice patterns, he said quietly. Across the room, his longtime associate and sometimes uneasy ally, Dutch Schultz, leaned against the wall with arms folded. Dutch was a relic of another kind of era, sharp-suited, sharp-tongued, and accustomed to solving problems with finality. Yet even he had learned, through years of uneasy coexistence in New York's underworld, that Bumpy's silence often signaled deeper calculation. Disappearing how? Dutch asked. Bumpy placed the letter on the table. No arrests. No charges. Just boys who don't come home. Dutch exhaled slowly. That's not business. That's something else. And that was the word neither of them spoke aloud. Something else. Harlem had faced brutality before. The Great Migration had carried thousands north with hope in their pockets, only to find prejudice waiting at train platforms. Housing discrimination, wage theft, police harassment, none of it was new. But disappearance was different. Disappearance left mothers without graves to weep beside. Disappearance erased evidence and replaced it with doubt. It was the quietest form of terror. Over the next 2 days, Bumpy moved through the neighborhood like a man assembling pieces of an invisible map. He visited barbershops where news traveled faster than telegrams. He sat in church basements after choir practice ended. He listened more than he spoke. 3 families confirmed what the letter implied. Young men stopped late at night by plainclothes officers, escorted into unmarked vehicles, and never processed through any official precinct. 1 mother clutched a photograph so tightly that the edges had begun to curl. They told me he'd be home by morning, she whispered. It's been 3 weeks. Bumpy did not offer empty promises. He did not say, I will bring him back. Instead he said, you will not be alone in this. And somehow, the way he said it made the words feel heavier than guarantees. On the 3rd evening, as snow began to dust the rooftops, Bumpy requested a meeting at a small jazz club after closing hours. The musicians had already packed their instruments. The chairs were stacked. Only a single bulb hung over the bar, casting long shadows against the walls. Dutch arrived first. Then 2 ministers. Then a local schoolteacher whose brother had vanished. In October, finally, a man who rarely appeared in public gatherings, a retired postal worker known for his meticulous memory and his habit of recording license plate numbers in a pocket notebook. They laid their fragments of information across the bar like puzzle pieces: dates, locations, descriptions of vehicles. The retired postal worker cleared his throat. "It's always the same car," he said. "Dark sedan, no plates on the rear. Front plate registered to a city department pool vehicle." Silence settled over the room. Bumpy's fingers tapped lightly against the counter. "And the department?" The old man hesitated. "Sanitation," Dutch frowned. "Sanitation doesn't run midnight pickups." "No," Bumpy agreed softly. "They do not." It was not the kind of revelation that exploded dramatically. It was quieter, more chilling. If city resources were being used to abduct young men under the cover of routine operations, then the rot extended higher than street-level prejudice. It suggested organization, permission, protection. The ministers shifted uncomfortably. One of them finally spoke. "If this is what we think it is, confronting it openly could bring retaliation." Bumpy looked at him, not unkindly but steadily. "If we do nothing, it brings certainty." The tension in the room thickened. Dutch watched Bumpy carefully. He had seen men rush into battles fueled by ego. This was not that. This was something steadier, more deliberate. "What's your move?" Dutch asked. Bumpy leaned back slightly. "We do not accuse. Not yet, we observe." And so the next phase began, not with guns drawn, but with eyes opened. For 4 nights, volunteers rotated watch along the streets listed in the letter. They kept their distance, blending into doorways and storefronts. On the 5th night, just past 11, the dark sedan appeared. It moved without hurry, headlights dimmed. 2 men stepped out, plain coats, hats pulled low. They approached a group of teenagers standing near a corner grocery. Words were exchanged. One of the boys protested. A hand gripped his arm. Before the situation could escalate, something unexpected happened. Bumpy stepped forward from across the street. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply walked into the glow of the street lamp, his presence unmistakable. The men froze for half a second, just long enough to recognize him. "Evening," Bumpy said calmly. The grip on the boy's arm loosened. "Just routine questioning," one of the men replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Bumpy nodded. "Slightly." "Then you won't mind conducting it under proper paperwork." The street seemed to hold its breath. The teenagers stared wide-eyed. The volunteers in doorways remained silent but visible. "We're authorized," the second man muttered. "Then show it," Bumpy replied. There was no anger in his tone. No threat, only expectation. The first man glanced at the sedan, then at the growing number of witnesses. The calculus shifted. "Another time," he said tersely. They released the boy and returned to the vehicle. The sedan drove off without haste but without its intended passenger. The corner grocery owner exhaled audibly. One of the teenagers whispered, "They were gonna take me." Bumpy placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Go home," he said gently. "Tell your mother you were delayed by conversation." He watched until the boy disappeared into the building's stairwell. Dutch approached slowly. "You think they'll back off?" "No," Bumpy answered. "I think they'll adjust." And that was the danger. Interruption was one thing. Exposure was another. But dismantling something embedded within official structures required more than public interference. It required proof undeniable enough that even reluctant authorities could not dismiss it. The following morning, Bumpy visited the office of a local newspaper editor who had once refused to print stories that might disturb civic harmony. He placed a neatly organized stack of observations on the desk: times, dates, witnesses, vehicle identification numbers traced through a contact who owed him a favor. "I am not asking you to accuse anyone," Bumpy said, I am asking you to ask questions. The editor shifted uneasily. You understand the implications? Yes, Bumpy replied. Do you? Outside, Harlem continued its rhythm, vendors calling out prices, children hurrying to school, church bells marking the hour. But beneath that rhythm now ran something new. Awareness. By the seventh day since the letter's arrival, word had spread that someone was watching the watchers, and that was when the threats began. A brick shattered the front window of the retired postal worker's home. Anonymous phone calls warned ministers to focus on sermons. The schoolteacher found a note pinned to her classroom door. Stay in your lane. Fear crept into doorways. Doubt returned like winter wind. That evening, the small group reconvened at the jazz club. The mood was heavier now. They're escalating, Dutch observed. Yes, Bumpy agreed. So what's the next move? Bumpy stood near the stage where musicians usually performed, staring at the empty chairs. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned back toward them. They expect anger, he said quietly. They expect confrontation in shadows. What they do not expect is daylight. The ministers exchanged glances. You're suggesting? A public assembly, Bumpy finished. Not protest, not riot. Assembly. Dutch's eyebrow lifted slightly. You think they'll show up? No, Bumpy replied, but others will. The plan unfolded with deliberate precision. On Sunday afternoon, after church services concluded, residents were invited, not summoned, to gather on the steps of the very municipal building whose vehicles had been observed. There would be no accusations shouted, no names flung into the air. Instead, there would be testimony. Mothers would speak of sons missing without record. Witnesses would describe vehicles and dates. Clergy would ask why due process had vanished after sundown. And Bumpy would say only one thing. The morning of the assembly dawned cold, but clear. By noon, hundreds had gathered, not in fury, but in solemn curiosity. City officials peered through second-floor windows. Reporters hovered at the edges, notebooks ready. When Bumpy stepped forward, the murmurs quieted instinctively. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest. We are not here to accuse, he began, his voice steady and resonant. We are here to account. He paused, allowing the word to settle. In the city, records are kept for trash collection, for traffic violations, for library books overdue. Surely we can keep records for our sons. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the crowd. If there is misunderstanding, clarify it. If there is error, correct it. But if there is silence, he let the sentence hang. Then understand that silence will no longer serve as shelter. He stepped back. No shouting followed. No chaos erupted. Instead, one mother approached the podium. Then another. Their voices trembled but did not break. By evening, the story had traveled beyond Harlem's borders, and somewhere within the municipal hierarchy, men who had relied on obscurity began to feel something unfamiliar pressing in. Scrutiny. That night, as Bumpy sat once more by his window, the original letter resting on the table beside him, he allowed himself a single, measured breath. This was no longer about a handful of disappearances. It was about whether a community could insist upon visibility without descending into violence. Outside, a patrol car rolled slowly down the street, but it did not stop. The game had changed, and this was only the beginning. The morning after the Prudy assembly did not arrive with sirens or apologies. It arrived with stillness, the kind that feels deliberate. Harlem moved, but cautiously. Store owners swept sidewalks as if expecting something to break again. Mothers stood at windows a few seconds longer than usual before turning away. The municipal building across 125th Street looked exactly as it had the day before, stone-faced and indifferent, yet everyone sensed the atmosphere had shifted. The watchers now knew they were being watched. Bumpy Johnson did not mistake silence for surrender. He understood institutions well enough to know that exposure does not end corruption, it pressures it. And pressure forces adaptation. 3 days passed without incident. No dark sedan. No plainclothes confrontations. No late-night stops that dissolved into absence. On the 4th night, it returned, but this time it did not cruise through Harlem's center. It hovered along the industrial edges near the river, where warehouses absorbed sound and shadows were plentiful. The pattern had changed, not abandoned, but relocated. That told Bumpy something critical. They aren't stopping. Dutch said quietly when the news reached them. They're adjusting. Dutch Schultz had seen plenty of men protect power by shifting tactics. He recognized it the way a gambler recognizes a stacked deck. Bumpy folded his hands calmly. Then we adjust faster. This was no longer about interrupting a single abduction. It was about proving something systemic without igniting chaos. Harlem's dignity had begun to rise, and if it tipped into violence, the narrative would flip instantly. The newspapers would not write about missing sons. They would write about unrest, and those in power were waiting for exactly that. Over the next several evenings, Bumpy assembled a different kind of network, not enforcers, not street captains, but observers who could not be easily dismissed. Church elders, 2 business owners respected by downtown suppliers, a former court clerk who understood paperwork better than politics, even a white dock foreman who owed Bumpy a quiet favor. From years past, we do not chase the car, Bumpy instructed them. We trace its authority, the former clerk frowned. You think there's a paper trail? There's always a paper trail, Bumpy replied. The arrogance of misuse is believing no one will look. The retired postal worker who had first noted the sanitation vehicle registrations returned with new information. The sedan's front plate did indeed correspond to a municipal pool vehicle, but maintenance logs showed it assigned to a department warehouse supervisor, not law enforcement. And where is this supervisor at midnight? Dutch muttered, not on record, the clerk answered grimly. That word, record, lingered in the air. For years, Harlem had fought battles in alleyways and courtrooms alike. But this battle was different. It would be won or lost not through force, but through visibility. The strategy required patience, and patience was not something injustice often allowed. Then came the turning point, subtle, dangerous, and nearly invisible. A young man named Elijah, 19, soft-spoken, a trumpet player at a local club, did not come home after rehearsal. His mother reported it immediately. This time, however, the assembly had changed the rhythm. Reporters called her before she could call them. Ministers arrived within hours. Bumpy was at her kitchen table before dawn. What did they say at the precinct? He asked gently. They said maybe he left town, she whispered. Maybe he got mixed up in something. Bumpy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Elijah plays trumpet, she continued. He don't even drink. Dutch stood near the doorway, silent, watching Bumpy's expression. He knew that look. Not rage, not yet, but calculation moving into decision. They are testing us, Dutch said later, once outside. Yes, Bumpy replied, and they chose the wrong son. The industrial waterfront had become the new theater. It was remote enough to operate quietly but close enough to transport without attention. That night, instead of posting watchers at obvious corners, Bumpy placed them in unexpected positions, inside warehouses, on rooftops, among night shift dock workers. The dock foreman ensured access no official inquiry would have granted. Near midnight, the dark sedan appeared again, but this time, it was not alone. A second vehicle followed, a municipal truck that should have been inactive after hours. The men stepped out. They escorted Elijah from the sedan. He was alive, disoriented, but alive. Dutch instinctively tensed, but Bumpy raised a subtle hand. Not yet. The men spoke briefly with someone emerging from the warehouse office, a figure whose posture suggested authority. Money exchanged hands. Documents passed from glove compartment to coat pocket. Bumpy leaned toward the former clerk beside him. You see that? The clerk nodded slowly. That's not an arrest. That's a transfer. And in that single word lay the revelation. This was not rogue policing. This was trafficking of fear, the disappearance of young men under the guise of municipal authority, coerced labor, intimidation, relocation without documentation. It was corruption disguised as enforcement. Dutch exhaled sharply. Now? Bumpy's eyes never left the scene. Now we record. One of the observers, a discreet photographer who normally shot weddings, captured the exchange from a rooftop. Angle, clear enough to show faces. Clear enough to show the municipal insignia on the truck door. Clear enough to show Elijah being led inside. They waited until the men exited again. Only when the vehicles pulled away did Bumpy move. He did not storm the warehouse. He did not confront anyone in the dark. Instead, he entered through the dock. Entrance with measured calm, Dutch at his side. Inside, the warehouse smelled of oil and damp wood. Rows of crates lined the walls. In a side office, Elijah sat alone, wrists bound loosely, not beaten, not bruised, but frightened, when he saw Bumpy. Something in his shoulders collapsed with relief. They said I'd be working off a fine, Elijah murmured. But I ain't done nothing. Bumpy untied his wrists slowly. You did something, he said softly. You were born visible. Dutch scanned the room. No guards? They weren't expecting interruption, Bumpy replied. He looked around carefully, noting ledger books stacked on the desk. Take those, he told the clerk quietly. This was the moment that could have spiraled. The men responsible would realize quickly that their operation had been breached. Retaliation would be expected, but Bumpy did not plan retaliation. He planned daylight. The following morning, before municipal supervisors could shred documents or spin explanations, copies of the warehouse ledgers appeared on the desk of a city council oversight committee member who had publicly supported the previous assembly's call for transparency. Attached to the documents was a simple note requesting inquiry into unauthorized labor assignments and municipal vehicle misuse. No threats. No accusations. Just records. By noon, the first inquiries began internally. By afternoon, reporters were asking why sanitation vehicles were present at industrial warehouses past midnight. The captain at the precinct, who had once relied on dismissal, now found himself cornered by documentation. That evening, Dutch leaned against Bumpy's window ledge, watching Harlem below. You could have handled that warehouse differently, Dutch said. Yes, Bumpy answered. You didn't. No, Dutch studied him. You're not trying to win a fight. Bumpy shook his head slightly. I'm trying to end one. Outside, something else was shifting. Word had spread that Elijah was home. That the warehouse had been entered not with violence but with proof. That names were now attached to vehicles and signatures attached to logs. The fear that had once kept curtains closed began to thin, but power rarely retreats quietly. 2 nights later, Bumpy received a visitor he did not expect, the warehouse supervisor himself. The man arrived without escort, hat in hand, anxiety visible despite attempts at composure. You're stirring something dangerous, the supervisor said cautiously. Bumpy poured tea without offering it. Dangerous for whom? The man hesitated. You think you've uncovered something isolated. It isn't. There are people higher than me. People who won't respond as politely. I have not accused you. Bumpy replied calmly. I have requested inquiry. The supervisor's voice dropped. You don't understand the cost. Bumpy met his gaze steadily. I understand it better than you imagine. Silence stretched. Finally, the supervisor spoke again. What do you want? The question lingered between them, not transactional, but moral. I want records corrected, Bumpy said. I want sons returned. And I want this city to remember that authority exists to protect, not to harvest. The man swallowed hard. And if it refuses? Bumpy stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. His voice did not rise. Then the mothers will continue speaking. And the records will continue appearing. And daylight will become very uncomfortable. The supervisor left without shaking hands. Dutch emerged from the hallway once the door closed. You think he folds? Bumpy looked. Out at Harlem again. I think he's afraid. And the ones above him? They're not afraid yet. Bumpy admitted quietly. The next move would determine everything. Because now the operation had been exposed partially, but not dismantled entirely. The warehouse was only one location. The network likely wider. And the men higher up would not tolerate prolonged scrutiny. That night, as snow began falling again over Harlem's rooftops, Bumpy felt the weight of what was coming. Not violence but pressure, smear campaigns, legal maneuvers. Attempts to discredit him and anyone standing beside him. But something had changed. Irreversibly. The community no longer felt alone. Mothers who once whispered now spoke openly. Ministers who once hesitated now demanded answers in sermons. Business owners posted notices about civic accountability in their storefront windows. The watchers were no longer hidden, and somewhere inside City Hall, men accustomed to invisibility began to realize that the quiet man from Harlem was not seeking revenge. He was constructing inevitability. The battle was no longer about one warehouse, one sedan, or one supervisor. It was about whether a system built on quiet exploitation could withstand sustained visibility without collapsing under its own contradictions. And in the stillness before the next confrontation, Bumpy understood something essential, true. Power was not loud. It was patient, and the most dangerous move was not striking back. It was refusing to look away. The city did not explode after the ledgers surfaced. It did something more dangerous. It smiled. For 3 days, newspapers ran polite columns about procedural misunderstandings. City officials announced an internal review. The sanitation department issued a brief statement about clerical irregularities. The words were smooth, neutral, designed to soothe rather than expose. If someone did not look closely, it might have appeared as though justice was already unfolding. But Bumpy Johnson understood something most men in power pretended not to. Institutions rarely collapse under accusation. They adapt. They reframe. They reposition themselves as victims of confusion. And when that fails, they retaliate quietly. The first sign came in the form of a rumor. Columnist known for writing thinly veiled character attacks published a piece suggesting that certain Harlem figures were manufacturing outrage to increase influence. No names were printed, but the implication was unmistakable. By afternoon, whispers drifted through uptown cafes. Maybe the disappearances were exaggerated. Maybe the assembly had been staged. Maybe the warehouse records were taken out of context. It was subtle, not denial, but dilution. Dutch read the column with visible irritation. Dutch Schultz had spent years in rooms where narratives were traded like currency. He recognized the move instantly. They're trying to turn you into the spectacle, Dutch muttered. Bumpy folded the newspaper once and set it aside. Good, he said calmly. Dutch stared at him. Good, yes, it means they're uncomfortable. The true danger, however, came not from gossip but from isolation. 2 ministers who had spoken during the public assembly received letters warning that their church funding could face review. A city supplier informed one of Harlem's grocers that deliveries might be delayed indefinitely. The retired postal worker found himself questioned by plainclothes officers about unrelated tax matters. None of it overt, none of it violent, but all of it deliberate. Harlem felt the pressure, and pressure has a way of bending even the strongest backs. One evening, as snow melted into gray slush along the sidewalks, a small gathering convened once more at the closed jazz club. The atmosphere was different this time, not fearful, but strained. They're squeezing us without touching us, the schoolteacher said quietly. That's the method, Bumpy replied. One minister leaned forward. If this becomes economic retaliation, families could suffer. We have to consider that. The words were reasonable, responsible, and dangerous. Dutch watched Bumpy carefully. This was the moment that broke many movements, not through defeat, but through compromise disguised as prudence. Bumpy stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with unhurried precision. I will not ask any of you to risk your livelihood, he said evenly. This was never about martyrdom. It was about accountability. Silence settled. But understand this, he continued. If we retreat now, the disappearances do not stop. They simply become smarter. His voice never rose, yet the weight behind it pressed against the walls. We are not seeking confrontation. We are seeking records corrected. And until those records are corrected, the pressure remains. Dutch exhaled softly. There it was, the line. The next escalation arrived unexpectedly. A subpoena. Not for a municipal supervisor, for Bumpy. He was summoned to testify before a city oversight committee regarding interference with lawful operations and unverified public claims. Dutch laughed sharply when he heard. They're putting you on trial without calling it a trial. Bumpy nodded slightly. They believe public questioning will discredit me. And if it does, it won't. The day of the hearing dawned cold and bright. The municipal chamber was crowded, reporters in the back rows, city officials at the front, curious citizens filling the aisles. Harlem had turned out in quiet numbers, not in protest, but in presence. When Bumpy entered the chamber, he did not scan the room theatrically. He walked with steady composure, hat removed, coat folded over his arm. He looked neither defiant nor submissive. He looked certain. A councilman adjusted his glasses and began with measured politeness. Mr. Johnson, do you acknowledge organizing a public assembly accusing city departments of unlawful activity? I acknowledge organizing an assembly requesting transparency. Bumpy replied calmly. Murmurs fluttered through the room. Do you possess definitive proof that municipal vehicles were used for unauthorized detainments? I possess records that suggest irregularities, Bumpy answered. I submitted them to this committee. The councilman leaned back slightly. Are you aware that making unsubstantiated claims can incite unrest? Bumpy met his gaze steadily. Is requesting documentation now considered unrest? The chamber fell still. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, each inquiry designed to frame him as agitator rather than advocate. Yet Bumpy did not stumble. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He returned every question to one principle: accountability. Finally, a senior committee member cleared his throat. Mr. Johnson, what is your objective? The question carried layered implication, as though suggesting hidden motives. Bumpy folded his hands on the desk. My objective, he said quietly, is that no mother in this city be told her son vanished because paperwork misplaced him. The simplicity of the statement landed heavier than any accusation could have. There was no applause, no theatrics. Only stillness. The hearing concluded without resolution. But something had shifted. Reporters, who had arrived skeptical, now carried notes, filled with contradictions from municipal testimony. The narrative had not turned against Bumpy. It had widened. That night, however, retaliation sharpened. A fire broke out at the waterfront warehouse. By the time firefighters extinguished it, the office where ledgers had once been stored was reduced to ash. Dutch arrived at the scene with visible fury. They're erasing it, he growled. Bumpy surveyed the damage quietly. Flames still smoldered against blackened beams. They're erasing copies, he corrected softly. Dutch paused. You anticipated this? I anticipated fear, Bumpy replied. Indeed, duplicates of the warehouse documents had already been secured elsewhere, not hidden for leverage, but preserved for protection. Yet the arson signaled escalation. Whoever operated behind the sanitation vehicles was no longer merely uncomfortable. They were threatened, and threatened power becomes unpredictable. 2 nights later, a black sedan, not the familiar municipal one, slowed outside Bumpy's brownstone. It did not stop. It circled once, then disappeared into traffic. Dutch had been watching from across the street. "They're measuring distance," he said later. "Yes," Bumpy answered. "From what?" "From consequence." The real test came unexpectedly. Elijah, the young trumpet player rescued from the warehouse, was approached privately by 2 men offering employment in another borough. Cash in advance. No paperwork. When he refused, they suggested he reconsider for his own safety. Elijah reported the encounter immediately. Bumpy listened without interruption. "They're trying to provoke a reaction," Dutch said. "Yes," Bumpy agreed. "If they threaten the boy again, they will," Bumpy replied calmly. "But we do not respond the way they expect." The strategy evolved once more. Instead of confrontation, Bumpy orchestrated something unprecedented. An open invitation to city press and select council members to tour the industrial waterfront. Not under accusation, but under transparency. The dock foreman facilitated access. Clergy attended. Business owners observed. In broad daylight, they walked through warehouses, inspected municipal vehicle logs, and asked questions publicly. The tactic was brilliant in its simplicity. Corruption thrives in darkness. Bumpy forced it into sunlight. City officials, who might have quietly buried inquiries, now found themselves photographed beside concerned citizens. Journalists noted inconsistencies between maintenance records and vehicle usage. Council members, sensing political risk, began distancing themselves from any department unwilling to cooperate. The pressure was no longer localized in Harlem. It was municipal. And that changed everything. Yet as momentum built, so did danger. 1 evening, Dutch arrived at Bumpy's home with uncharacteristic urgency. "They've identified the one above the supervisor," he said quietly. Bumpy looked up from the book he had been reading. "Who?" "A deputy commissioner. Long tenure. Strong connections." The room seemed to narrow. "Evidence?" Bumpy asked. "Circumstantial, but heavy." Bumpy closed the book slowly. "This is the turning point," Dutch murmured. "Yes," Bumpy agreed. "Because if you expose him, they will come for me openly." Silence hung between them. Dutch studied him carefully. "You still intend to avoid violence?" "Yes." "And if they don't?" Bumpy's gaze remained steady. "Then we hold the line." The plan that followed was not dramatic. It was surgical. Copies of vehicle assignment logs, witness affidavits, and warehouse payroll. Discrepancies were delivered simultaneously to 3 separate oversight offices, not one. No single entity could bury them without the others noticing. Additionally, an editorial drafted by respected clergy outlined the moral implications without naming individuals, framing the issue as civic responsibility rather than scandal. Move forced the deputy commissioner into visibility. When reporters began requesting comment, he denied involvement, citing administrative delegation. But delegation requires documentation. And documentation now existed in too many hands. The climax of this phase arrived quietly. At a subsequent council session, the deputy commissioner announced a temporary leave pending review. No admission. No apology. But retreat. Harlem listened carefully to the news. The disappearances ceased. Not slowed. Ceased. For the first time in months, mothers slept without waiting for footsteps that never came. Yet victory did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile. That evening, Bumpy stood once more at his window, watching Harlem's streetlights flicker on. Dutch leaned against the wall behind him. "You did it," Dutch said quietly. "No," Bumpy replied. "We did. You forced a man out of power without firing a shot." Bumpy's expression remained contemplative. "Power removed is not power reformed," he said softly. This is only stability. Justice requires memory. Dutch smirked faintly. You're not satisfied. I am cautious. Outside, children's laughter drifted faintly through the cold air. Freer now, lighter. But Bumpy knew something. Others did not yet grasp that when corruption is exposed without violence, it does not disappear. It waits. And somewhere within City Hall, someone higher still had taken notice of the quiet man from Harlem who refused to play by expected rules. The disappearances stopped, but Harlem did not celebrate. Celebration implies completion, and nothing about what had unfolded felt complete. Deputy Commissioner's temporary leave was announced with carefully arranged language: health reasons, procedural reassessment, administrative restructuring. No mention of ledgers. No mention of sanitation vehicles in midnight alleys. No mention of mothers who had memorized the sound of footsteps that never returned. Yet the silence had changed its tone. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of scrutiny. Bumpy Johnson understood something that few men in positions of influence grasped. When a system yields slightly, it often does so to protect something deeper. Removing one official did not mean dismantling the machinery that allowed him to operate. It meant someone higher had decided he was expendable. And expendability is not accountability. For 2 weeks, Harlem breathed carefully. Patrol cars still rolled through streets, but slower now. Plainclothes officers no longer loitered with the same confidence. The industrial waterfront felt quiet after dusk. Elijah returned to his trumpet, though his music carried a new tremor, not of fear, but of memory. Then came the letter, not the trembling, desperate script that had begun everything. This one was typed, delivered directly. No envelope. It sat on Bumpy's desk when he returned home one evening. Progress has consequences. No signature. No demand. Just a warning. Dutch read it twice, jaw tightening. Dutch Schultz had known threats in his lifetime, loud ones, violent ones, theatrical ones. But this was different. This was restrained, calculated. They're not done, Dutch said quietly. No, Bumpy replied. Then what's the move? Bumpy folded the paper once and placed it beside the original handwritten letter that had sparked the investigation. 2 messages, 2 tones. One conflict. We do nothing, he said. Dutch frowned. Nothing, we continue living. That answer unsettled even Dutch. Because sometimes doing nothing is the boldest escalation. The next test did not come from the waterfront. It came from downtown. A citywide audit was announced, not of sanitation vehicles, but of community organizations that had participated in the assembly. Funding reviews, zoning compliance checks, tax inspections. It was retaliation disguised as oversight. Harlem felt it immediately. Church boards received formal notices. The school teachers' institution faced surprise accreditation review. A small business owner who had spoken publicly found inspectors measuring sidewalk clearance with newfound enthusiasm. The message was clear. You exposed us. Now we expose you. That evening, the jazz club, long closed for business, reopened its doors. Privately. Not for music, for resolve. Ministers, business owners, the retired postal worker, the dock foreman, Elijah's mother, they gathered once more. They're punishing participation, the schoolteacher said. Yes, Bumpy replied. Then what do we do? For a moment, no one spoke, because this stage required more than strategy. It required courage. Bumpy stood slowly, his presence commanding without effort. We were never fighting a warehouse, he said quietly. We were confronting a habit. He let the word linger. A habit of silence. A habit of selective enforcement. A habit of believing some neighborhoods will absorb injustice quietly. His voice did not rise, but its steadiness carried weight. They are testing whether we will return to that habit. The retired postal worker cleared his throat. And will we? Bumpy looked around the room. at faces lined with exhaustion yet sharpened by dignity. "No," he said. The plan that followed was not confrontation, it was expansion. Instead of responding defensively to audits and inspections, Harlem would respond with transparency beyond expectation. Churches opened their books publicly. Businesses invited reporters to observe inspections. The schoolteacher organized a community forum on civic rights and municipal accountability, inviting city officials to attend. The tactic disarmed retaliation. If oversight was the weapon, transparency became the shield. Dutch watched it unfold with reluctant admiration. "You're forcing them to behave," he said one evening. "No," Bumpy replied. "We're refusing to misbehave." The distinction mattered. And then came the revelation that altered everything. The Oversight Committee, pressured by growing public curiosity, released preliminary findings regarding the sanitation vehicle misuse. Buried within the report was a subtle line. Further inquiry suggests authorization extended beyond departmental supervision. Extended beyond. Higher than the deputy commissioner. Dutch read it twice. "Now it gets dangerous," he muttered. Because exposing corruption at operational level is one thing, implicating political leadership is another. The city's mayor, cautious, ambitious, sensitive to reputation, suddenly faced a decision. Ignore the widening inquiry and risk scandal, or confront it and risk exposing allies. He chose visibility. A public address was scheduled. Harlem waited. The night before the mayor's speech, the black sedan returned to Lenox Avenue. It did not circle. It stopped. Two men stepped out. Not plainclothes. Not municipal. Well-dressed. Controlled. They approached Bumpy as he stood beneath a street lamp. "We represent interests concerned about escalation," one of them said evenly. Bumpy regarded them calmly. "Escalation of what?" "Public pressure." Dutch stood several feet behind, silent but watchful. "You've made your point," the second man continued. "Disrupting further could destabilize the city." Bumpy's expression did not shift. "The city destabilized itself," he said. Quietly. The first man exhaled slowly. "There are opportunities for mutual understanding." There it was. Not threat, not apology, accommodation. Bumpy stepped closer, his voice still measured. "Mutual understanding requires shared truth." The men held his gaze. "And if shared truth damages reputations?" one asked. "Then reputations were poorly constructed." Silence. The men nodded once, returned to the sedan, and drove away. Dutch approached slowly. "That was your last warning," he said. Double quotes. "Yes," Bumpy replied. "And you didn't bend." "No." The following afternoon, the mayor stood at a podium beneath the city seal. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. He spoke carefully, acknowledging irregularities, promising reform, announcing independent oversight into vehicle misuse and unauthorized detainment practices. He did not name individuals. He did not assign blame publicly, but he committed to structural review. And in politics, commitment spoken publicly becomes difficult to retract. Harlan listened in quiet rooms, in barbershops, in church basements. The announcement was not triumphant. It was restrained, but it was irreversible. Within weeks, municipal vehicle assignment protocols were revised. Independent civilian review mechanisms were proposed. Records of after-hours detainment required multi-level documentation. The disappearances did not resume. The audits against community organizations quietly dissolved. And something far more significant occurred, not in City Hall, but in Harlem itself. People stood straighter, not because power had been seized, but because dignity had been defended. Without violence. One evening, Elijah performed at the reopened jazz club. His trumpet carried through the room with steady clarity. Ministers sat beside business owners. The retired postal workers smiled faintly at the dock foreman. Even Dutch, normally restless, leaned back in reflective silence. Bumpy stood near the back wall, hands folded behind him. Dutch approached. "You changed the rules," he said quietly. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "We reminded them of their own." Dutch studied him. "You could have taken advantage of this. Expanded influence. Consolidated control." Bumpy's gaze moved across the room, to Elijah's mother wiping quiet tears, to the schoolteacher, laughing softly with colleagues. This was never about control, he said. Outside, Harlem's streetlights glowed against evening air that felt lighter somehow, not free from injustice, but fortified against it. The final test came not with threat, but with recognition. A city council resolution acknowledged community vigilance as instrumental in reform. It did not name Bumpy directly, but everyone knew. He did not attend the ceremony. Instead, he visited the brownstone where the first letter had arrived. He held it again, reading the trembling words that had begun everything. "They are taking boys again." He folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer beside the typed warning. 2 letters, 2 eras. 1 outcome. Dutch joined him at the window. "It's over," Dutch said. Bumpy considered the word. "No," he replied softly. "It's balanced." And that was the difference. Justice was not an explosion. It was equilibrium, restored through patience. Harlem did not cheer. It endured, and in enduring, without surrendering to violence, without bending to intimidation, without losing its composure, it accomplished something more powerful than revenge. It forced a city to look at itself. The black sedan never returned. The industrial warehouses resumed ordinary operations. Mothers slept with doors unlocked. And somewhere within City Hall, men learned a lesson they had not anticipated. The quiet man from Harlem did not fight with fury. He fought with inevitability. And inevitability, once awakened, is far more dangerous than force. The story did not end with applause. It ended with stillness. The kind of stillness that feels earned, the kind that carries dignity, the kind that tells a city without shouting that justice, when pursued with composure and courage, leaves no room for silence to hide behind.